Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to continue our discussion of project planning. This is covering the later steps of the health communication program kind of sequence here, focusing mostly on the situational analysis and research methodologies and paradigms. These are related things. Again, I'm not sure these belong in the exact same chapter, but they are both important and they will help you move forward with your projects. Now, when it comes to doing the research and planning side of things, this is really where academic skills can shine. Now, the textbook is emphasizing the need for a multidisciplinary team to have a really good, successful intervention, including stakeholders, academics, politicians, whoever might have some sort of stake in this kind of intervention. But in particularly, Schiavo is emphasizing the need to bring in the community members. We call that participatory research. We'll get into that a little bit more, but for now, I want you to recognize your unique position as a health comm scholar. Whatever you do in the future, if you are involved in these kinds of interventions, you're going to have a special skill set that can be applied to these problems. So let's keep in mind that this is an act of strategic communication. When we're talking about a health communication program or intervention, we're talking about a strategic message, not unlike a marketing advertisement or a public speak or any sort of persuasive speaking. As such, the message should always be audience-centered. It should be evidence-based, and we should work on credibility as well and establish that. And you have all the building blocks to do that at this point in your academic careers, but we want to look at how these things can be applied in this specific context. So in order to be audience-centered, evidence-based, and credible, well, that means that we need to have good research and good audience analysis slash situational analysis. The textbook is kind of lumping these two together. Well, they're not lumping it together. They're saying that the audience analysis is part of the situational analysis, whereas other sources might argue that it's a separate step. But really, they're talking about building that big picture. And since Schiavo was very into community-based participatory research, they're very big into these interpretive kind of approaches. They want to have a big picture in that situational analysis and understand what matters to the community members. So let's see how we can develop, refine, and apply these academic skills to this specific setting. A good comprehensive analysis should be capturing as many factors as it can. So if we were to stop at just audience analysis or profiling the audience, perhaps based on demographics, that alone is not going to be as informative as a comprehensive situational analysis. So meaningful analysis requires that whole contextual consideration. Now, ask yourself, what is the best way to gather information pertaining to the environment in which this health communication message is going to go out? How do we gauge how that message will be received? How do we estimate what that communication environment looks like? Well, you may guess that the best way to do that is to go right to the source and ask the people, right? Ask the people that you're trying to interact with. That's that emphasizing of the participatory research. So the situational analysis, I've dropped that word a couple times now. What does that mean? Well, here's our definition. We're asking ourselves, how do individual, community, social, political, and behavioral factors affect perceptions of the health issue and its potential solutions / barriers, all that good stuff. Well, here I've taken the liberty of throwing up once again the diagram of the health belief model. This is one of my go-to examples because it's one of the oldest theories that tried to deal with these kinds of problems, recognizing that it's not as simple as saying, hey, here's this thing, why don't you go get a tuberculosis screening so we can make sure you don't have tuberculosis, right? There's more factors that go into the decision to pursue or not a specific health action. And so the health belief model, again, is a good example of how that kind of works out because it's trying to at least recognize that there are so many different factors. You've got the demographics and maybe those kinds of demographics combined with the socio-psychological variables might make up our audience profile, but there's more to it than that. There's the cues to action, there are structural variables, there's perceived susceptibility, perceived seriousness, perceived threat. All of these things kind of get tangled up together. So developing a good situational awareness kind of means filling in the blanks in this kind of model. If not the health belief model, that's fine. It doesn't have to be a health belief model, but we're kind of going through and filling in these blanks, answering the questions. What are the structural variables? What are the existing cues to action? And how can we leverage some of those things towards the desired outcomes? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about a situational analysis. Now, obviously, that entails a lot of moving parts. This is a figure coming right from the textbook, figure 11.1 from chapter 11, showing you the key steps of situational analysis. Now, they're kind of going up this staircase here, so it's not read left to right here, it's read right to left in that sense, but we've got all these interrelated steps here. Let's take a look at them in greater detail, shall we? In this diagram, you can see that it's divided kind of into two halves, with the research phase coming first, in which you're gathering the relevant data, answering the relevant questions, and trying to get that big picture of the thing. And then the second phase would be the data discussion and analysis, where you're looking at all that stuff together to make better sense of it, but you're also discussing the data, you're interacting with your stakeholders in the community to try and figure out what's really going on, what is actually influencing this problem. So the first step here in the research phase would be define and understand the health issue. Boom, great. Make sure you do that, right? We often act on our assumptions about health issues without taking the time to stop and talk about what we're actually looking into. So that's number one. Define and understand your health issue. What are you interested in, and how does it work, right? What are the major factors? What are the major risks that cause specifically that health issue? Is it a acute mercury poisoning kind of thing? Well, that's the first step, right? We're talking about cognitive and developmental issues associated with acute exposure to methylmercury in the environment. Well, that's pretty clear. That's a specific issue, right? But it has to be specific. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to answer the questions you have about it, and you're never going to be able to intervene on it. If you keep it too vague, diet, exercise, pollution, that doesn't help us, right? Because there's too many things that fall into those categories. Now, once we've established what the health issue is, we need to identify the key groups, stakeholders, and constituencies. So that means the people that this health issue affects and the people that have influence over the health issue. So that would be helpful as well, because those are the kind of people we're going to need to be interacting with in order to make this intervention get off the ground and be successful. Once we've identified those different groups, we want to try to understand the social, political, and other determinants of health, right? So that this is a real big buzzword, social determinants of health. If you get involved in public health, that's where a lot of interest is these days, right? That entails health disparities, that entails all those demographic factors we've talked about. All of those things are kind of in this category. So the more you understand those things, the better off you'll be in terms of understanding the big issue. So we're not just now looking at the health issue and its specific acute causes. We're looking at, all right, who influences it, how are they influenced, and how are those things, can we establish those relationships, right? Does eating more fish accumulate more methylmercury in the body, right? That would be a factor. That would be a physical determinant of health, but there are other determinants of health. If we're talking about, for instance, the Anishinaabe and Great Lakes Native Americans, the Chippewa tribe, that is a subsistence fishing culture. That would be a social determinant, right? If that is part of their culture and their cultural practices to eat more fish and more walleye, for instance, well, maybe they're going to have more of a mercury exposure. That's not necessarily an acute scientific relationship, because there are other social factors that lead into that. Now, after we have a more or less clear understanding of these key groups, stakeholders, constituencies, and how they interrelate, those would be the social determinants. We want to develop, share, and discuss an audience profile and segmentation report, right? So we break down these things and say, okay, among all these different key groups and stakeholders, what is the group we're specifically trying to intervene on? Sticking with the current example, are we trying to reduce chronic mercury exposure in populations of childbearing age women, right? Because developing fetuses are very susceptible to issues from methylmercury and other environmental contaminants. So that's a specific group. Okay, so that would be part of our audience segmentation, and that we know that that's the group we're trying to target, but there's other groups around that that are factoring into that issue as well. So this next step, we're talking about developing, sharing, and discussing that audience profile and segmentation report with the other team members, including stakeholders, to try and figure out how we can how we can intervene, right? So then next, research existing programs, initiatives, and resources. What is being done now to target this issue? We want to look at those so that we can then go to the next step, highlight unmet communication needs. What is not happening? What gaps can we see? What needs to be filled? And how can we address that with our health communication and our health communication program? Then ultimately, that's kind of the last step here, describing overall barriers to program implementation and propose a change. So that change that we propose is kind of the last step. Now, I'm not super concerned about you memorizing each and every step in its correct order. You should have a good understanding of this for the exam, but what I am more interested in is you understanding how each of these steps works, and that you take the time when you're developing a program to go through those steps. Now, some lessons from this kind of just glancing over the key steps of the situational analysis. And we're going to look at these in even greater detail, so don't worry. But the immediate lessons we can take from even just looking at this figure is that you can never talk to too many stakeholders, right? We are trying to get as big a picture as we can, as clear a picture as we can, and we want to know who is influencing this and who is influenced by this health issue. So you can never talk to too many stakeholders. The more people involved with this that you talk to, the more information you're going to get and the clearer the picture. So don't just go ask one person about it. If possible, you want to do deep research, you want to do focus groups, interviews, surveys, whatever you can get away with. Now, in the real world, there are practical limitations to that. So you don't even need to do the thought experiment of like, well, what if you talk to everyone, Jonathan? Well, that's never going to happen. So a safe best practice here is to try to talk to as many stakeholders as you can, given the practical limitations of the situation. And we really another lesson we can take away from this is that we really want to develop an understanding of key factors influencing health disparities. So those social determinants, again, there's a reason why that's such an important and popular buzzword right now, is that we are recognizing that there are things other than the acute cause and effect of, again, for instance, methylmercury exposure. There's more to it than mercury. Right? There's more to it than being exposed to mercury. Is it methylmercury? Well, then that's a bioavailable form, it's not the same as just people going around eating, handfuls of mercury. So we need to understand those contextual factors, because when we say something like social determinant of health, or when a public health person says social determinant of health, all they really mean is context. It's just a fancy way of saying what are the contextual factors that influence these disparities. And the reason we call them health disparities is because they tend to influence different groups differentially. That's all that health disparity means. So when we're trying to get a sense of what those are, we're deciding which groups we are interested in intervening on, the most at-risk groups, and what factors are going to influence that relationship the most. In these early stages, in the comprehensive analysis, the situational analysis, we should not yet be developing specific communication objectives and strategies yet. Program goals, yes, but probably not the specific strategies and objectives, because you're going to have to revisit those later on. We want to establish that clear picture before if we don't get to the top of the staircase and figure out the overall barriers to the program implementation and proposed change, well, then we can't make those specific objectives. Now, remember that the objectives are different than the program goals. So the goal, we would want to know that from the beginning. So we get to define and understand the health issue. We say, all right, we want to reduce the incidence of chronic uh, mercury exposure, or we want to reduce the mortality of acute mercury poisoning, whatever it may be, right? Those program goals, we can get that early on, and we should. However, the concrete communication objectives, that should be the last step. So don't worry about that right now. Let's just work on getting that big picture understanding. I want to spend a little more time talking about audience segmentation because that's kind of one of those middle steps. And again, once we've gathered enough information and we're trying to figure out what to do, who to talk to, well, the audience segmentation and audience profile is going to be useful for this. This is kind of going back to that original idea of, is the audience analysis separate? No, it's an intermediate step perhaps, but it is a really important one. So I want to spend some time talking about it. Now, when we segment our audience, that can be done either using demographics or stage of behavior change or something else entirely. So for this, we may go all the way back to chapter 2 and remember some of those theories that we discussed, such as the diffusion of innovation theory, in which you have the early adapters, the late adapters, the laggards, all those people. So there's a couple different ways we can segment the audience, as it were. But remember those theories that are designed, those models and theories that are designed specifically to do that. So we want to ask ourselves, well, what seems to be most important here? It may not be demographics, right? They may not be that accurate. Demographics, even if we can detect specific trends, specific health disparities based on those demographics, remember that they may also be a categorical kind of proxy for the really influential factors. So, for example, if we see health disparities associated with a specific group, it might be associated with like minority status, for instance, but it's not the minority status. It's not the race or ethnicity of that group that matters. That's just kind of a category, right? We're detecting a trend that is associated probably with more influential factors such as socioeconomic status, right? So if that minority group is associated with lower socioeconomic status, it's the socioeconomic status that's the health factor, not their minority status, not their ethnicity, right? So we just want to be aware of that. That may seem like kind of a contrived or simplistic distinction, but it's really important to keep in mind that demographics are not the same as causal factors, right? They're categories. So maybe that's not the best way to segment our audience. We want to recognize who we need to reach and what are their attitudes. And so we do want to consider those kinds of proxies, but we also want to recognize after we've looked at the audience and determined who we're trying to reach, it may be more important to understand their attitudes about the issue. And that's why I've thrown this diagram up here for you. This is coming from social judgment theory. This is another classic social influence theory that is showing how persuasion can be more or less difficult. So let's look at this a little bit deeper. So the reason I included this theory at this point is because if we're talking about segmenting the audience based on their attitudes around the issue, well, this is one of those theories that has shown how that might factor into your persuasive efforts later on. So all I really want you to take away from this right now is that depending on how the audience feels about the issue, you're going to have an easier or harder time persuading them to pursue the health outcome. And we'll revisit this later on when it comes to specific communication interventions, but I want you to keep that in mind, right? If you are trying to get the audience to agree to something that they strongly disagree with, for instance, well, that would fall under what Sharif would call the latitude of rejection, right? So that's going to be a hard sell, would be a simple way to put that. If you are trying to persuade them to do something they already agree with, that would be very easy to do. The only thing you really need to remember here is that we don't always have to completely convert people's attitudes and behaviors. We will have greater success if we aim for something, or at least frame the message in such a way that we can be on the latitude of non-commitment here, or on the latitude of acceptance, right? If we ask them to change something huge and fundamental, that's going to be harder. But you can have intermediate steps in terms of persuasion. So that's all I really want to introduce about this for now, but keep that in mind as we go along. When we're talking about what are the audience's attitudes about the issue, Well, this can be more influential than anything else, and it's really hard to change attitudes sometimes, but we can frame issues in such a way that they align with how the audience already feels about the issue, right? It doesn't have to be super confrontational and be like, hey, you're doing something wrong, completely change your behavior. You're going to have intermediate steps that lead to greater success in terms of persuasion in that way. We'll revisit this later on when we get to the specifics of health intervention messaging. Now, remember that the different segments of the population and the audience are going to warrant different priorities and strategies. This is where we get into the primary audience and the secondary audience. In the case of health communication programming, we're talking about, well, with a primary audience, it's who does this primarily affect? So going back to my previous example, if we want to reduce uh, the morbidity of chronic mercury exposure in women of reproductive age. Well, they would then be the primary audience, right? Women within this population of reproductive age. That would be the primary audience, but the secondary audience would be people who can affect that issue. So who else might be able to influence this issue directly or indirectly? This could be family members. This could be uh, the government. This could be tribal elders. It could be a great deal of many different people. Another example here is, for instance, older Americans at risk of dementia. And we know that getting regular sleep and getting enough sleep can help reduce the risk of dementia in older Americans. So if we want to develop a health program that is reducing either the morbidity of dementia in older Americans, maybe we're going to be that will be our key audience, and we're targeting them for this intervention, encouraging them to get more sleep. But the secondary audience here would be, again, those family members who can influence, for instance, the routines. If it's a multi-generational family, as is very common in some cultural groups, those family members are going to be essential to encouraging better sleep hygiene or offering instrumental support so that those older individuals can get more sleep. And so the primary audience is who we're trying to affect most directly. Like maybe they're most affected by the health issue, but there's still a lot of other audience members who might be able to influence this health issue. And we want to try and reach them as well. Now, in terms of planning for the intervention, when we get up into those higher steps on that staircase, we want to recognize that there are probably already interventions about most issues, and we want to assess those before we plan our own intervention. What are the existing initiatives? And we want to recognize that this is an iterative process. Remember every diagram from the textbook, it's always these arrows going around and around, right? You have the intervention, then you have assessment, and then you bring it back in, evaluation, and plan again, and develop, and you keep refining the intervention as you go along. So part of that process is, if we're stepping into that cycle, we want to look at those existing initiatives, assess them, and see what's happened so far, what was effective and what wasn't. So what has been done before, and did it have a measurable effect in the desired direction or not? If something went wrong, then we would want to focus on addressing that issue. And we can compare that to some other problems that we have identified in our research phase so far. Did the previous intervention take into consideration the cultural significance of fish consumption? Right? If not, well, that might be something we could focus on more in our current intervention. There are also likely to be, depending on the health issue, resistance points or groups. I'm sure you can think of a lot of examples of this. In today's highly politicized and polarized world, there's always going to be someone who's going to say, no, that's a terrible idea, don't do that. And they might be right, they might be wrong, but we need to account for it either way, right? We should be taking criticism seriously, and we should be engaging in discussion and constantly interrogating our own intentions. But we also want to recognize that when we have an intervention, there are probably going to be some resistant points, maybe even strongly coordinated and motivated activist groups or lobbying groups or whatever. What kind of resistance are we likely to face? Not just cultural resistance on the part of the key group we are aiming our intervention at, but also other political actors. And we can, again, compare this back to social judgment theory in the sense that are we trying, those aren't necessarily the people you're trying to convince, right? You're not trying to convince the people who this message falls squarely in their latitude of rejection. They're not the ones you want to reach, right? But you want to try and reach the people in between those steps, right? The people who maybe haven't decided yet, and maybe the key group and those resistant groups, they're probably not always going to be the same. They might be, and that's going to be a huge challenge for some interventions. But if you are trying to improve adherence to a vaccination program, your target audience is probably not going to be really strongly passionate anti-vaxxers, right? That's not really how it's going to work. But you need to anticipate that those groups exist and that they're going to have influence over the health situation as well. We also want to examine existing initiatives for assessing existing resources and channels that we can leverage. So communication channels, what has worked in the past. If we developed a fish contamination and consumption app, for example, sticking with my previous example here, how successful was that? Is that an ongoing resource / channel that we can leverage going forward? We want to identify those at this stage as well. Now, we also want to move forward to consider the communication needs of the group and specific communication failures. So this should all be audience-centered, the needs and channels, right? So revisiting what has been done, how did it affect that audience, and if something didn't work out, why not? Additionally, potential barriers is going to be something that comes up here. So not just the resistant groups, but the costs, resources, capacity, infrastructure, clarity of the goals and messages, time constraints, social norms, commitment, the list could go on, but these are all potential barriers, right? In an ideal world, we would be able to have enough money to fix X problem. I think people's tendency as they start to warm up to something like advocacy or they start to get passionate about intervening in things, the knee-jerk reaction is like, oh, well, the government should just pass a law. That almost never works, right? Just passing a law almost never works. And it's not very practical because it's not considering culture. It's not considering social norms. It's not considering how messages transmit through the population, how things become socially acceptable. It's not always considering costs. The criticisms against government interventions are often, well, cost associated. What is this going to cost us? And if the answer is, well, let's just print more money, that's not going to be a very popular answer either, because that has all sorts of externalities and other consequences that get introduced to the system. But you get the idea here. We must consider those potential costs, because if our intervention is not practical, it's not going to work. And that's the bottom line when it comes to health interventions. Now, those costs are going to be specific to implementation. If we are not considering these costs of our specific implementation, we're not being realistic and we're not being, well, frankly, our program is just not going to work at all. It's not a program if it doesn't consider the limitations and the potential barriers. Okay, we're going to switch gears a little bit here because Chapter 11 is also talking about research methodologies. Research methodologies is such a huge topic to cover that we probably can't do it a ton of justice here. So I will link in a more extended discussion of research paradigms in the class resources. But I do want to give you an overview here because Chevo is giving us some perspective, but I think we could use a little more context. They are narrowing down research methodologies to two types. You've probably heard of these before. You have qualitative and you have quantitative. These are specifically methodologies or intermediate, like kind of categories of methodologies, and they have to do with how we are conducting research. So a research methodology is how we conduct research. Qualitative research has to do with smaller samples and richer understanding of that human experience. Quantitative has to do with larger samples and predictive patterns and measurable relationships. When it comes to doing a quantitative analysis, usually we're talking about statistical analyses and survey research, looking at big data sets, something like that. What we're trying to do there is actually measure relationships between factors and variables. What is causing this issue, right? We want to be able to measure that relationship so that we're sure we're targeting the exact factors that we need to. The qualitative research is going to be better for enriching our understanding of, for instance, the experience of this health issue, or identifying issues in that community that we may not have known about because we're not part of that community. That's what qualitative research is about. Um, Here's a terrible picture I took from the textbook because I couldn't find this figure elsewhere, but you can go revisit table 11.1, which is kind of exploring the differences here. But you can see some of the major differences is that qualitative research is providing a depth of understanding, whereas quantitative is working on measuring levels of actions and trends, describing relationships, and providing ideally proof of those relationships. So qualitative is interpretive and quantitative is descriptive more than anything. You may be asking why you should care about that. Well, I'd like to spend the remainder of this lecture explaining why you should care about that, because these methods are suited to answering different kinds of questions, and they do different things. You want to make sure you have the right tool for the right job. Now, the textbook author seems to be a bit more qualitative than quantitative. That's fine. That's appropriate for what they are referring to as participatory research. And when we have this whole involving the community kind of approach, we really need to make sure we have appropriate interpretive and qualitative methods to enrich our understanding of those issues. However, Shavo may be downplaying the importance of quantitative research. I'm a little biased because I am a statistician, but that also allows me to provide you an opportunity to better understand quantitative methods and what they're used for. So I would like you to have a more sophisticated understanding than breaking down quantitative and qualitative here. So as far as our exams and everything is concerned, we want to make sure that we at least know the major differences between qualitative and quantitative. But I want you to understand that these methods go deeper than just surface level what we're doing. When it comes to the communication discipline and a lot of the humanities, research usually falls into one of three categories. We typically divide this into three different categories. You've got your social scientific research. That's going to be more of the quantitative stuff, doing psychological experiments, doing survey research, all that stuff. You've got the interpretive stuff. That's going to be more of the qualitative stuff, whether you have focus groups or interviews or what have you. And then you also have this other one, which is the critical side of things. Critical would probably be more of the advocacy that we're talking about. Now, obviously, this class is designed to leverage all three of these, and all of them are going to come in at different points in the research process. You need each one of these. And I've also taken the liberty in this diagram of illustrating that they have overlap. Both social science and interpretive research are very systematic. Right? There are established processes and protocols for gathering that data and getting that picture. Social science and the critical paradigm are both concerned with evidence, but their kind of evidence is very different. So critical research may take anecdotal evidence and examine that, right? Because they're really interested in that lived experience. In that sense, critical and interpretive overlap each other in that they're both subjective, whereas social science tries to be objective. Now you can also see here, I've written right here in the middle of this little Venn diagram is what I would just kind of call human experience. I want to remind you that all of these are intuitive ways of thinking, um, with perhaps the exception being in the scientific method, in which we're kind of trying to work against the subjectivity. But every human is capable of thinking in all three of these ways, and we often do so interchangeably. However, when it comes to research, we need to separate these out in kind of an order of operations to make sure that we're getting the clearest picture that we can. But I want you to understand that these all overlap and they're all part of human experience, but they do have strengths and weaknesses. Now, going back to the idea of methodology versus paradigms. So the paradigms are those those categories, these philosophical approaches. The methodological approaches are what are we doing? So again, quantitative and qualitative research, those are methodologies typically. So in the interpretive paradigm, what we're talking about is the basic assumption is that reality is kind of subjective and socially constructed. So you can imagine that with the qualitative research, how that assumption manifests. We're looking at people's lived experience and we're trying to better understand their perspective. That's that subjective assumption, right? This has been called thick description, is one of my favorite ways to describe interpretive research, in which we are looking at a specific instance, a specific group, a specific lived experience, and trying to understand it to the greatest depth that we can. And again, it's recognizing that knowledge itself is contextual from the perspective of people studied. And this is necessarily creative and value laden in terms of the process. Interviews, focus groups, we are doing a lot of, this is why we call it interpretive, right? We're doing interpretation. We're looking at these specific experiences and trying better to understand them to a greater depth. Social science is depending on more of the classic scientific method and its assumptions. One being that reality is knowable and discoverable, objectively so, right? That there is a universal objective reality. That's what we're dealing with in the assumptions for social sciences. It is what we call post-positivist. From a philosophical perspective, what that means is, well, if you're familiar with a null hypothesis, that's what we're talking about. You've all taken research methods, so hopefully this is old hat by now, but post-positivism means that, well, we recognize that we can never prove anything to be absolutely true, but we can prove things to be absolutely false, and that's where the null hypothesis comes in. We try to prove something wrong, and if we can't do it, then it supports the previous hypothesis that, well, then this is a likely relationship. So what social science is trying to do is to predict behavior through objective, precise, systematic, and repetitive processes of discovery. That may be statistical methods, that may be scientific investigation, but it's relying on these assumptions. Now, the critical paradigm is, again, assuming that reality is subjective and socially constructed, but its goals are a little bit different. So advocacy falls into the critical paradigm for the most part. It tends to be described as postmodernist in that way, and that it is recognizing subjectivity as being paramount in human experience. We don't need to go too far down this rabbit hole, but what critical is usually doing is using that subjectivity of lived experience to help deconstruct the status quo, and the assumption would be that the status quo is usually oppressive. Established systems of thought are oppressive in some way, and so that's where the advocacy comes in, right? We need to change this thing. Here's how we do it. So all of these are important, and you can see part of what we're doing in this class is trying to leverage all three of these. Now, in order to do so, we have to do mixed methodology. And what that means is we need to recognize the strengths and weaknesses of all of these things. And so you can compare what these different paradigms do to different stages in a classical research process, if that helps you keep them apart. So step one, identify and describe a problem. Well, interpretive research is great for that. Qualitative research is great for that. If you sit down and have interviews with as many people in the community as you can, you'll probably start to figure out what is important to them and how that issue is affecting them, at least through their eyes. That qualitative research is essential for that. But the next step in the research process would be we want to test the validity and concern of those relationships. The stakeholders may think that something is a factor when it doesn't have any measurable influence on the actual health issue. That's why you want to have some sort of social scientific or hard scientific approach to test the validity of those relationships that you are intuiting in the qualitative research. So hypothesis testing And statistical analyses are typically what's happening in this kind of field. We're trying to establish those relationships. I want to determine a relationship between this social factor and this health outcome. We need social science to do that. Now, the third step would be to describe or prescribe corrective measures. That's where the advocacy comes in and the critical scholarship. But it should be, as the textbook is reminding us, it should be evidence-based, right? It should be based on things that we do know, on our best understanding of those relationships. We should not be flying by the seat of our pants when it comes to advocacy, because it is an emotional and passionate job, and it needs to be properly informed with the available information and data. Precisely because it's such a subjective thing, because we can often be wrong if we're just pursuing our passions. Anger and outrage are not actual arguments. They can be useful in terms of persuasive tools and framing mechanisms. However, they cannot replace genuine investigation and hypothesis testing when it comes to establishing actual relationships between variables. We need all three of these. I feel very strongly about that, and this class is a good example of that. We can't just focus on the cause of the health issue and expect that to fix things, right? The health belief model and the tuberculosis examples of that showed us that, right? That's where we got the health belief model. People weren't going in for the tuberculosis screening, even though they were driving X-ray trucks to the neighborhoods and saying, hey, get a free screening for tuberculosis. People still wouldn't do it. So we need the other things to figure out why, right? We had to do interpretive research to feel, oh, they don't trust authority. Well, I wonder why. There's a lot of good examples as to why, but you get the idea. And then, all right, well, how do we correct that issue? Well, maybe we have to target their perception of authority and build trust. Well, that would be more of a critical scholarship side of things. So it takes all three of these methodologies to make a meaningful and impactful intervention. Here's that in a diagram. This is an example from a paper that we're currently revising for publication, but this is an example using what is called traditional knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge to inform the scientific method. So traditional knowledge is the textbook mentions it once or twice, but if we're talking about community-based research, this is an important part of that. You go to the stakeholders. Traditional knowledge is usually associated with indigenous populations. So again, if we're going to the Great Lakes Anishinaabe and talking to them about fish consumption, well, the traditional knowledge would be culturally, how do they talk about fish? Do they hold some species to be more sacred than others? Are there ceremonial purposes? Are there some, if you go to French Polynesia, there are taboos against pregnant women eating ocean fish. And that actually lines up with our scientific understanding because ocean fish tend to be bigger. They tend to have more mercury in them. Anyway, you get the idea here. So what is that traditional ecological knowledge or traditional knowledge? We can use that to inform a hypothesis, for instance, and then we can test that hypothesis. So I like this French Polynesian example. Okay, so we use that knowledge to inform a hypothesis that there might be a actual health reason why it is taboo for pregnant women in this culture to eat ocean fish. What would that be, right? We inform that hypothesis. Oh, well, it might be a relationship with mercury, methyl mercury in the environment. We know that. We know that's an established relationship. Let's see if we can corroborate that. What species are taboo? What are their mercury levels? Well, that's the scientific research that we can do there. Turns out that there is naturally occurring mercury in the environment. This isn't just a pollution thing. Pollution can lead to many acute instances of this, but mercury occurs naturally in the environment because it comes out of volcanoes, it accumulates in the oceans, it becomes bioavailable, and it accumulates in larger species of fish. Thus, we can measure the levels of bioavailable mercury in species of fish, and we can see, well, yeah, ocean fish, they tend to operate at lower levels in the ocean. They're higher in the food chain. They accumulate more mercury. That would be dangerous for pregnant women. And then we can use that scientific information to further contextualize the knowledge, and that can feed into action policy and more critical research. So, or in our case, the advocacy. So what I'm trying to illustrate for you here is that if we separate these methodologies, mixed methods is probably a misnomer because we're not just slapping this all together. Each method is good for answering separate questions, and we can contextualize all that information accordingly. So again, this is an example of that. This is an order of operations model for community-engaged research that incorporates traditional knowledge. And the argument in this paper that we have not yet published is essentially that doing so, separating these powers, as it were, and establishing that order of operations ensures the integrity of each. And that is complementary to the goals laid out by the National Institute of Health strategic plans and other, things. So if we want to meet those kinds of established goals when it comes to health and health interventions and health communication programs, we should probably keep in mind the strengths and benefits of these different methods and apply them appropriately. So let's wrap this up and kind of summarize. This is going to be a rather long video, but it is important to consider all these factors kind of at the same time as we go forward to start planning our projects and our programs. So we want to recognize that when it comes to research paradigms, they each have their strengths and limitations, and they answer different kinds of questions. So are we trying to predict behavior? That would be quantitative or social science. Are we trying to describe behavior? That would be qualitative or interpretive. Or are we trying to change behavior? And that would rely more on the critical paradigm. All of these are necessary, and all of them have to be leveraged appropriately to have a successful intervention. Health communication programs are involving a lot of mixed methods. That's exactly what the textbook is advocating for. We don't want to take too myopic a view of a health issue and assume that, like, well, just telling people what causes this thing is enough. It's not. It almost never is. And so we need to leverage a lot of mixed methods, and that's tricky. It's very hard to do. And it's hard to do, especially in teams, because everyone likes their own method. Everyone thinks their method is going to be the best for solving problems, but really they have their own strengths and weaknesses, and this is precisely why the textbook is advocating for mixed methodologies and mixed method teams. So it's important for you to understand these differences, not just from a philosophical point of view, but to better understand how all those steps in the process of developing a health program, how those work and why they're important. So I hope that this gives you a general understanding. If you're curious about research methods and paradigms, you feel free to watch that other video, and I'll go deeper into the philosophy informing those different things. But for now, just recognize that some tools are better for certain jobs than others. And so we want to make sure that we've got things lined up in a certain way. The steps of this process are designed to follow that logic, whether or not it's saying so deliberately. So I hope you find that useful. We'll discuss more in terms of how to build a successful intervention and actually pursue those objectives in upcoming videos. But for now, I hope that helps, and I hope you found it interesting. Take care.